Welcome to Podcast Movement Evolution's 2024.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kai Chuck, and I'm the global lead of podcasting at YouTube.
Hi, my name is Steve McClendon, and I lead our product efforts around podcasting at YouTube.
Cool. So today we're here to talk more and share more about what we're doing on the YouTube side, especially related to podcasting. We're seeing the industry and podcast consumers at large start to embrace video and embrace YouTube a whole lot more. And podcasters are indeed finding success on our platform. Now, while we've launched a bunch of features over the past couple of years to make the lives of creators and podcasters much easier, we're just getting started. And there's a whole lot more that we're going to talk about later today that we're working on. Okay, cool. First, let's start with the shift that we're seeing in podcasting overall, kind of industry-wide, and that's consumers are embracing video more than ever before. When we look at the numbers, Triton Digital, Cumulus Media, and Coleman Insights have all published studies in the past year which show that YouTube, at least in their books, is now the #1 podcast consumption app podcast platform in the world. And while Edison's data shows us as #2, we're quickly closing that gap between us and the #1. We're now only 2% off in terms of kind of monthly average listeners. Studies also show that YouTube is now the #1 platform for podcast discovery. Over a third of users, weekly podcast listeners who listen to a new podcast in the past 6 months, actually started their listening journey on YouTube. And this is especially true for Gen Z. According to Edison, 84% of Gen Z monthly podcast listeners have discovered a podcast on YouTube. So, not surprising, but it really makes us feel good that new users are coming to us to find new podcasts. Our growth is also the result of how video podcasts are really resonating with consumers, especially Gen Z and podcast newcomers. 84% of Gen Z monthly podcast listeners have listened to a podcast, who listen to a podcast prefer one that has a video component to it. And across demographics, 37% of podcast listeners prefer to listen to podcasts with video and actively watch while they listen. And this is up from 28% in October 2022. And finally, according to Cumulus Media, 40% of podcast newcomers, i.e. those who've started listening in the past year, actually prefer to listen to podcasts with video while they actively watch and listen at the same time. And that's compared to 27% of podcast pioneers, or people who kind of started their podcast journey over 4 years ago. So really, the trend that we're seeing with new listeners, new users, is YouTube and video. Now, those are the numbers and trends that we're seeing kind of with the podcast ecosystem at large. Specifically to YouTube, we're seeing a bunch of really kind of surprising trends as well. The first is that we're seeing explosive growth with podcast consumption in the living room and just consumption in the living room at large, where we're more often seeing users really watch YouTube and listen to YouTube on their connected TVs. In fact, living room is the fastest growing source of YouTube watch time, with viewers globally now watching over 1 billion hours of YouTube on their TV every day. And we're really seeing this trend extend to podcasts as well, where consumers have increasingly embraced podcasts in the living room. And when we ask them about it, when we're asking our users kind of why they prefer, or why they like to listen to their podcasts in the living room, there are 3 main reasons. First is that they want to be entertained in the evening. It sounds kind of surprising, especially if you think about the paradigm of, I listen to a podcast when I'm on the go or on mobile. But that is shifting. Users want to lean back, sit back, and watch or listen to their podcasts even when they're not traveling. And this leads to the second reason. Viewers want to watch podcasts, consume podcasts with others. And again, this is a shift from how we've traditionally viewed podcasts as a solo experience. Thirdly, they also cite that kind of being in their connected TV or being in the living room gives them less distractions, where they feel like being on mobile or desktop is really distracting. but they enjoy the TV experience because they want to be able to lean in and kind of feel immersed with their favorite podcaster, watching them on screen and feeling like they're in the same room with them. Besides that, we're also seeing tremendous growth internationally. In fact, over 80% of YouTube's audience is outside of the US. And that number, those figures, are very similar when we look at podcast consumption on the platform as well. So with all that data in mind, let's talk about some podcasters who have seen success on the platform, both with audio-only content as well as with video content. So first up, we have The Fall of Civilizations. They are a UK-based podcast that uploads both video and audio episodes to YouTube. They feature episodes that explore how ancient societies rose to power and then quickly fell. The show has gained upwards of 138 million views since launching in 2019, with 90% of that viewership coming outside of the UK. Their video episodes average 5.6 million views on average per ep, while their audio episodes are around 1.5 million views per ep. So very, very strong numbers for essentially a history podcast. Another great example of a successful YouTube podcast is Rotten Mango. They are a true crime podcast hosted by Stephanie Sue. And although Stephanie has a history of being on YouTube, Rotten Mango has never uploaded to, or hadn't uploaded to YouTube until March of last year. So since their first video episode debuted on YouTube last year, the show has expanded its reach, amassing over 2.3 million subscribers, over 316 total views, and they average around 2 million views per episode. So Stephanie speaks on camera while also using stills, video footage, and other kind of B-roll and imagery to really bring her stories to life. Lastly, the podcast also shines a light on international stories where they talk about non-US based true crime instances, as they believe that kind of every story deserves to be told. So with those two examples in mind, if you're a podcaster or you want to start getting into podcasting and you're thinking of getting on YouTube, great news. Starting next month on April 26th, our team will be offering live virtual YouTube Podcasting 101 workshops. In these free workshops, we'll be sharing best practices that can help you launch and grow your podcast on YouTube. We'll also be answering live Q&A. So if you have any questions, any myths for us to help debunk, happy to do that. You can register to attend with the QR code on screen. We'll also be showing this slide again at the end, so if you don't capture it now, don't worry, there's be another opportunity to capture it. So with that said, let me pass it to Steve, who will talk to you about all the tools and features that we're developing over the next year.
Awesome. So as Kai said, my name is Steve. I work on product for podcasts at YouTube. And a question I get is kind of like, what does that actually mean? Like, what does it mean to work on product? And the way that I think about it is we build features and experiences for podcasters who want to bring their content to YouTube, or creators and are looking to kind of distribute onto YouTube, and then we think about the user experience. So for your audiences, what is the experience of consuming your podcast? How do we make that podcast accessible to them? How do they find your podcast? And so, maybe in a boring way, I'm going to talk a little bit about algorithms and UX. Hopefully it's interesting for the room, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the things we've launched, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we have coming up. So broadly, we think of YouTube, you might interact with YouTube on your phone, and you might think of it as like, an app, but really YouTube is everywhere where users are. And so, we do have the core YouTube experience, which if you have the YouTube app on your phone, or, you've watched an embedded video somewhere on the web, that's sort of like the core YouTube experience. But we also have the music experience, which is really optimized around listening journeys. And through the music app, you have access to YouTube in your car, or on smart speakers, or other sort of like very audio-specific listening journeys, which obviously for the podcasting audience is really critical. And then as Kai touched on, Living Room is our fastest growing surface. In many ways, it might feel counterintuitive to think about Living Room relative to podcasting. I'll touch more on this in the future, but I think of it as like, People have used their TVs as radios for the better part of 70 years, and in as much as YouTube is television for many people, it is unsurprising that they use YouTube like they use radio. And you might be watching it deeply engaged, but you might also be doing other things where you would normally listen to a podcast, like when your eyes and hands are busy, you're cooking dinner and you have the TV on in the background. A lot of times, particularly for younger users, we see that they have YouTube on in the background, and podcasts are a great content fit for that use case. So just touching kind of on the core YouTube experience, a lot of the work that we've done in the past year is really how do you disambiguate a podcast from another YouTube video? It's awesome that podcasts are intermingled with YouTube videos, so when you're sort of on YouTube, you can bump into and discover your podcast content. But we also want to make sure that our users are aware that, hey, this is a podcast, and podcasts are going to have some special experiences around it. And so we have done a bunch of work. We launched a destination page, so a dedicated place where we highlight podcast content. We have a number of improvements that we've made to the search experience, particularly around representing podcasts as shows. YouTube is really good at recommending individual videos and episodes, but you all as podcasters, you oftentimes think of your content as a show, and you want the user to be able to engage with the show. And so we launched a number of features around that. We have designation. Again, this is how do you identify what a podcast is on the platform? And so, we've started to kind of move forward with some lightweight designation, and I'll talk a little bit more in, what's coming next section, some of the ideas that we have going forward. And then on the channel page, if you have a YouTube channel, there's now a dedicated podcast tab. There's a place for your show or your shows if you have multiple shows to be represented. On the music experience, I touched on this. The music app is really where we envision users going to listen. Backgrounding, downloading content. That's a paid experience on Main right now, but it's free in the YouTube Music app. The YouTube Music app also has integrations across kind of listening products. I mentioned the car. I'll touch more on the car in the future. Smart speakers, we're testing some smart devices and other places where you might want to have your listenable content be accessible to a YouTube user. And then Living Room, we've talked quite a bit about Living Room. As Kai mentioned, the numbers are really surprising to us, but I think when you talk to consumers and you think about the user behavior, in many ways it is unsurprising. Like I have a teenager in my house. Sorry, I shouldn't touch my mic. I have a teenager in my house. He doesn't think of it as a podcast. He engages with a lot of podcast content, but he thinks of them as shows. And in the spirit of you want to be everywhere your audience is, and you want to be everywhere where people might want to engage and listen or watch your content, the Living Room is a really important device. And what I'll say is, the beauty of the YouTube ecosystem is you also get these seamless experiences. So I could be listening to a podcast in my car, I could come home, and I can just pick up watching it on my television. Similarly, obviously it travels to my phone as well, and so there's all these different ways where YouTube is working to create these seamless consumption experiences, recognizing that users throughout the course of their day oftentimes are engaging with podcast content. Kind of moving more to the studio side, and apologies for the really tiny slides. I'll touch on this again, but obviously we have some workshops coming up, so we'll talk more about this. There are really two main ways to bring your podcast to YouTube. So if you're a video podcaster today and you're on YouTube, you have a channel, within the studio tool, there's a way for you to designate and mark your podcast playlist so that is identified as a podcast. And you might ask yourself, well, why does that matter, right? So I think you'll get things like the badging, eligibility for the destination page that I talked about, some of those search experiences that I talked about, but more importantly, what it does is it informs the algorithm. And a large portion of what my team works on also is how do we improve podcast discovery? I'll give you a kind of what I think for most folks who are podcasters in the room will feel like a really obvious example. If I'm consuming an episode, we should probably recommend the next episode when you're done. In the YouTube environment, that isn't necessarily the intuitive thing because YouTube wants to recommend all kinds of stuff to you. You know, if you've seen your right rail or you've seen your watch next bar, you might get recommended, you know, very far afield content. And so some of the work that we're doing in terms on the algorithm side is how do we support really podcast consumption use cases, which is if I listen to the first episode, I probably want to listen to the next episode. And so that's some of the work that we're doing, and that's some of the benefits of designating your content as a podcast. The other thing, I think many podcasters rely on RSS. They work with their hosting companies. We do have a path where you can upload your RSS content to YouTube as well. And when you upload your RSS content to YouTube, it's kind of silently behind the scenes, we actually convert it to a video. I'm not really going to call it a video because it's not really a video, but it is an asset that can live on the YouTube site. And we put this in really to make it as easy as possible, right? So if, you know, things like setting up a video studio feels really daunting to you, there is a pathway for you to just upload your RSS feeds as well. And then we can't talk about Studio without talking about analytics. YouTube has incredibly rich and robust analytics. In many ways, the YouTube ecosystem kind of grew up alongside the podcasting ecosystem. If you think about the characteristics of a YouTube creator and a podcaster, they sort of run the gamut of, you know, individual creators who might be creating in their home to very large networks who have, you know, lots of folks that they would want to give access to and control. And podcasting has that same dynamic, right? They're really large networks and they're individual creators. On the data side, we've spent the better part of 15 years really thinking about how do we deliver high quality data to our creators to really help them make better content. So some of the things I'll touch on, you know, obviously we have the basics like views and watch time and average view duration, where are people dropping off, key moments, what are the places where you get the most engagement? Where are the places people are scrubbing back and actually saying, oh, do you know what? Actually, I want to listen to that part again. How do viewers find your episodes, right? You talked a lot about YouTube and the YouTube algorithm and, you know, some of the challenges. You know, like I think folks are intimidated by the algorithm, and I mean, I'm not going to explain it because I actually don't fully understand it myself, but knowing where your viewers or where your audience is finding your podcast on YouTube is one of the things that we're really committed to trying to deliver. And so in your analytics, you'll see things like, oh, this person found my podcast on home, or this person found my podcast in that Watch Next experience, or this person searched for me, or this person went to my channel page and found me. And so that will help you think about, you know, how do you kind of grow your audience and how do you improve your distribution across the platform. And then you can look at what your top episodes are. So like, what is the content that's really resonating with audiences? One difference with YouTube versus RSS is in RSS, somebody might subscribe to your show and they sort of, you know, basically download every episode because, you know, they might have set up auto downloads in their podcast app. And that will give you a view that sort of is very linear in terms of your consumption, but that might not actually be how people are listening to your content. And on YouTube, you know, it's really important for us that we represent what's actually happening here. And so top episodes will help inform you, oh, this is the content that really resonated with my audience. And you might want to do more of that, or you might want to build on that and leverage that. So real quickly, I'm going to talk about some of the things that we're working on this year. We're really excited to continue the way that I describe it internally is like, how do you make podcasts a first-class citizen on YouTube, right? You know, we want to continue to lean into what makes podcasts distinctive and special. You know, like just by my way of background, I've worked on podcasts for years. Before I worked at Google, before I worked at YouTube, I love the medium. I would love to see podcasts really be successful on the platform. And so a lot of the work that our team is doing is how do we sort of like take advantage of all the benefits of YouTube around discovery, around reach, around the fact that, you know, we basically anyone who's on the internet is on YouTube, but also kind of, you know, lean into what makes podcasts special. So in terms of some of the things that we're doing, for folks in the room who work with hosting companies, we have made some updates to the YouTube API. And specifically, what that means is the YouTube API will support podcast designation. And so what we're trying to do here is make it easier for you working with your hosting company to just go ahead and use your pre-existing hosting company to serve this content to YouTube. Along with the video API changes that we made, we also have data API, which provides that data back into your hosting company. So if you want a one-stop shop and you want to continue to work with your hosting company, we will support that. We're really excited that we're testing with a handful of partners who are here at this conference. We are testing with Headliner, Libsyn, Omni, and Red Circle, really to ensure that we get this right. And then we're looking to release this in the back half of the year to the wider public. If you're interested in being a test partner, feel free to talk to Kai or I after as well. So we do a lot of things right, but I do look at feedback like this, and it reminds me that we still have a ways to go, right? So we talk to our podcast consumers quite a bit, and we get feedback like this, which is, hey, I'm looking for this podcast, I can't seem to find it, your experience is complicated. And that really leads to a bunch of the work that my team is trying to do on the search and discovery side. One of the things that I'll highlight here is, YouTube is 16:9 thumbnails. So, it is, everything looks like a video. Here, we are really focused on, maybe we should improve show discovery, and we should make shows present. We should represent them as square show art. So when you look at it, you're like, oh, that's a podcast. I recognize that as a podcast when you're in the YouTube environment. So those are some of the things that we're working on. I talked about the algorithm. On the algorithmic side, we're also doing quite a bit of work to think about how show discovery should work. And then importantly, what is the equivalent of a subscribe on YouTube? What does a follow look like? How do we ensure that someone who is your fan and really wants your content has access to that content every time you publish a new episode? So we're doing a bunch of work on the show discovery side on main. We have a lot of work to do to make the YouTube Music app function better for podcasts. It does a lot of things well. I have an hour-plus long commute. As an Android Auto user, I feel the pain of the Android Auto experience at times. And so I'm really excited. We have a whole slew of fixes to improve the experience, ranging from things that might be less visible, like the way that downloads operate, to things that are more visible, like obviously the car UI and reducing the number of taps. So as I'm driving into the office, I don't have to tap 3 times to get to a podcast that I want, but it can be presented to me right on the home screen. And then we get a large amount of feedback from Podcast Power users. Like we have up to 2x speed controls, and they're like, give me 3x, give me 4x. I don't know who these psychotic people are who listen to podcasts at 4x, but we are looking to basically, try to serve some of these user needs. And as Kai mentioned, well, actually, no, this is something separate. Maybe one of the things that came through, but I'll say more explicitly, is there's a lot of ways that YouTube is like podcasting from an ecosystem perspective, and then there are a lot of ways where YouTube is similar, but not exactly the same. And we have a number of resources for podcasters who are really trying to understand the YouTube ecosystem. So this isn't always specifically about podcasts, but it's about how does YouTube work? And so we have the Creator Insider channel, which is run by Rene Ritchie. He is actually a podcaster himself and a creator, and so he's really empathetic with kind of the needs of the creator, and he really tries to translate the work that product teams like myself do to creators like yourself or podcasters like yourself. He actually just launched a podcast. I'm really excited about that. His first podcast episode is with Todd Beaupre. Todd heads up search and algorithms for all of YouTube, and he talks about the importance of thumbnails. And that might not be the kind of thing that you as a podcaster would have front of mind, but thumbnails are incredibly important in new discovery and new audience building on YouTube when you're sort of sitting in this visual environment. And so I highly recommend checking out the Creator Insider channel. And then we do have another channel which is oriented at YouTube creators as well, where we do have podcast-specific content. So there's videos on, how do you bring your RSS feed to YouTube? What is a podcast on YouTube? And so I highly recommend that, if you're interested, that you spend some time taking a look at that. And then the other thing that I would add is a reminder that we are doing a bunch of these workshops for podcasters. So as Kai said, here's the QR code again. And we certainly encourage folks to sign up, participate, bring your hard questions. I think particularly on the product side, I want to hear where we're doing well and where we're not doing well. Where we're not doing well ultimately informs a lot of our roadmap. So yeah, super excited about that. Thank you for the opportunity to share a bit with you. And yeah, we're going to head out.
Thank you, everyone. April 26th. April 26th.
Thank you.